Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everyone to this seminar today in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Lars Brabyn. Lars is an associate professor in the geography program at the University of Waikato, and he's also a research associate at the Te Puna Haumaru Centre for Security and Crime Science. Lars is a specialist in the application of GIS, Geographical Information Systems, and in quantitative data analysis, especially using big data sets that require automated analysis with scripts, and so on. And in this capacity, he's worked on a range of applications, including health, crime, migration, demography, landscape, and ecology. But today, Lars is here to talk to us about prison violence and how we can understand it using data and maps.
Thanks, Gabrielle. It's a real honour to be able to give a presentation. But just a bit of context about this work. It's part of a project called Nga Tūmanakotanga, which translates as Turning the Tide on Prison Violence. It's an MB-funded project that got funding for over 5 years, led by Ara Poutama Aotearoa. The project's near completion. The funding stopped and we're just sort of wrapping it up now. The project goal is to understand prison violence from an ecological approach. And what we mean by an ecological approach is looking at the sort of more holistic level, looking at it from multiple angles, using multiple methods. So it's looking at the whole context of a prison, including the management and the environment and sort of the culture of a prison. And we're hoping through this understanding that we can suggest management practice that will reduce violence. The Department of Corrections keeps records of all the prison incidences, so there's a lot of these incidences. The data is known as the COBRA data and includes information on different degrees of violence as well as non-violent incidences as well, and also has information on the prison population. So I'll talk more about this data as we go through this presentation. But it's a very exciting data set. It's we downloaded it from 2011 to 2025, and there's about 2 million records associated with it. So it's quite a large data set, and it's rich in information. So yeah, just a bit more background about the COBRA data set. Each incident is categorized, and we went through and took those categories and classified them ourselves as being violent or seriously violent, and also whether the violence is against staff. So this gives you an idea of the types of categories that are involved in each of the for violent categories, and then you got the the seriously violent categories. Yes, seriously violent categories can be consistently recorded because generally someone ends up in hospital or the police are involved. So across prisons, then it's going to be quite consistent in how that's recorded. While the violent categories, it could depend on the different culture in the prisons. So there can be multiple records for one violent incident. So can have multiple categories associated with it, but there can also be multiple prisoners involved. So just because you've got 2 million records doesn't mean that there's 2 million incidences. Okay, so typically this information is used to present information on prison violence at a New Zealand level. So Department of Corrections publish this data on their website. This is the statistics that I've generated from the COBRA data. So you can look at it as it varies across the different years. You need to take into consideration the number of prisoners. So you need to calculate the rate of violence, and we usually use the rate of violence per prisoner year. And so we can track how the violence is changing across time. So you can see from the graphs here, there's a general increase in violence, but this could actually be related to improvement in the recording culture. When we look at serious violence, you see that it varies a bit more. So depending on what time scale you use, so if you use a more later time, then you'll see that it's increasing. But if you, over a longer period, you see that it goes up and down. As I say, there's the serious violence, there's more consistency with the recording with that. So we can generate New Zealand level statistics. We can also generate statistics at a prison level. So, and we can look at the different prisons in New Zealand. There's 18 of them, and we can look at the number of prisoners in each prison. So we record that using a metric called prison years, because some prisoners are only in there for a few months. And then we do the count of the violence per prison a year. So you can see the variation across the different prisons. But the problem with the prison level statistics is it averages out the variation that happens within a prison. So I'll talk more about that. We can also look at the prisoner level, so we can get statistics for different groups of prisoners. So looking at age classes, and we've got ethnicity, gangs, and gender. The P is perpetrators, the V is victims, and the U is unknown. Again, we need to look at the prisoner population. So we really need to look at the percent of violence as a rate. So here we have, you can see, looking at the percentage of the population under 20, there's a high percentage committing violence. Okay, so we can see that they're the most violent group of prisoners. With ethnicity, there's some variation here, but then you've got to consider that some of these ethnicities might be represented by younger groups, so it could actually be related to their age. You can look at whether the prisoners have gang affiliation or not, and you can see that the rate of violence is higher with gang-affiliated prisoners. Surprisingly, for some, females are more violent than males when you look at it in terms of percent. Perhaps people in corrections, that's not a surprise, but what's happening here, you can look at the actual prisoner population. This is actually throughput. So female throughput on average is about 1,000 female prisoners, while with males there's about 16,000. So the throughput or the prison population for females is a lot less, and it's generally considered that, you know, females that do end up in prison, which is sort of quite rare, you know, they have a lot of issues that they're dealing with, so they tend to cause more violence. This COBRA data is really interesting from an analyst point of view. You can tell all sorts of different stories from it, which I quite enjoyed researching. One of the things I was interested in is the repeat perpetrators. So something like you got the number of violent offences might be around 8,600. This is an average over 10 years. Only 2,000 of them are non-repeat offenders, while 6,000 of them are repeat offenders. So I've got the percentages down the bottom here. So 74% of the violent offenders are repeat offenders. And then some of these prisoners commit a lot of violence. So nearly 10% of the prisoners are repeating their violence or offending more than 20 times, which I find quite interesting. And I guess, you know, if you reduce repeat offending, then you would reduce prison violence. Interesting, if we look over here, look at serious violence. So I've got serious violence here, but they also got serious violence against staff. We can see that, you know, there's not many repeat offenders when it comes to violence, serious violence against staff, which is sort of understandable. I guess, corrections officers going to have very low tolerance for serious violence. Prisons typically consist of prison units, right? So this is the Rumitaka prison. I captured this from Google, so it's public information. And within a prison, there can be quite a few different units, and those units vary a lot. So some are high security and have a lot of violence, and some are low security and have very little violence. And the prisoners can't move around. If we want to look at the ecology of violence, then the prison unit scale is the sort of ideal scale to use, so we can capture sort of the culture within different units and look at the management regimes, and also look at the mix of the prisoners that are in these prison units. So for this project, a lot of what I'll talk about is looking at the prison unit scale. When we measure the violence using prison scale compared to prison unit scale, we get difference in the statistics. So I can take the average violence for each prison, and then, which are 18, and then get the average for the whole country. So you get the average violence per prison being close to 1, okay? And then you can get the standard deviation, which is 0.48. Another way of calculating this is to go to the prison unit level. So you got the average violence per prisoner for each unit, and so there's 228 of them. Then you get the average of all those units, and so you get close to 1 as well. But you see that the standard deviation is a lot higher. So if you want to look at the variation in prison violence, you really need to look at the prison unit scale rather than the prison scale. So the prison unit, we can look at levels of security. Okay, so they're each classified in terms of their security level, and we can calculate the violence count per prisoner year for each of the different security classes. And you can see that there's a huge variation between these security levels. So the maximum security and the high security are way higher than the minimum and low security prisons. And that goes across all the different types of violence. So looking at serious violence, it's the same. Looking at violence against staff, and also looking at serious violence against staff. You can see that if you want to understand prison violence, then security level gives you a very good understanding of how prison violence varies across the different units. You can also look at the size of the units. Here again, we've got the different types of violence that we're examining. And you can see that the smaller units tend to be more violent. Okay, so very small units, which can be special units. So there can be sort of units that are designed for people that are causing lots of trouble. But generally, I mean, with prisons, the corrections officers will put the less violent prisoners in the bigger units. So they manage it to try and reduce the violence. So, and people that are very violent, they will tend to put in high security units, which are a lot smaller. So there are lots of different information that we can use to investigate prison violence. So, okay, I've looked at the security class and the size of the prison units, but we can also look at gang entropy. So this is where the COBRA data has all sorts of information. So for each prisoner, if they're associated with a gang, that's recorded. And so using that information, we can look at one unit, and we can look at the diversity of the gangs within that unit. We can look at percent gang affiliated. We can look at prisoner ethnicity. We can also look at the lead offence that put the prisoner in the prison in the first place. So whether they're a drug offender or in there for violence or burglary or sexual offences. So we've got all that information, so we can count up the number of prisoners for each of these offence types. We can look at how long they've been in prison for, and we can look at their age. So there are lots of different variables that we can use for trying to, model prison violence. And when you have a lot of variables, you've got to be careful about the types of techniques that you use for modelling. So typically, ordinary least squared models don't cope well when you've got more than 4 or 5 variables. You can also have problems with collinearity as well. But with machine learning, which some people call them AI techniques, they can cope with hundreds of variables, and collinearity is not a major problem. So for this project, I used machine learning to try and understand prison violence and model it. So I could talk a lot about how machine learning works, but I won't. I mean, essentially computers do trial and error, so they just keep trying different models until something really works really well. That's the guts of machine learning. These machine learning tools are easy to use. Basically, you list your response variable, which in this case is rate of violence, and then you will have all your predictive variables, which are sort of the security level, the size of the prison, and the offences, which I just looked at before. So, it's also not important to really fully understand how these functions work. I mean, what is important is knowing how valid the results are. So having some trust in the results. When people are using Google Maps, I mean, they don't necessarily understand how it works, but what you do get to understand over time is whether or not it can be trusted. So people have their own validation model, I guess, for Google Maps, and then over time, if it works, they get to trust it and they use it more and more. So what's most important when we're working with machine learning and AI is validation, essentially. So we've got to look at the performance of it. So this is some of the results of the AI. So got a R-squared value of 0.53. So this result has been published in a paper. So if you want to try and understand it in more detail, read this paper. It's in the New Zealand Geographer. With machine learning, they produce predictions, but an issue with machine learning and AI is they tend to be seen as like a black box. So you don't really understand the model. So it makes very good predictions, but you don't really understand much about what it's predicting. So with linear regression models, you've got your coefficients for each of the variables, and that tells you whether things are positively producing positive outcomes or negative outcomes for your model. So you can look at how different factors are shaping your model. So in response to the sort of black box approach of machine learning, there are tools now that are being developed to help explain what's going on with machine learning. So they're called explainable AI. So these techniques developed. So one of them is these what they're called shape graphs, shapely additive explanations, and they take a little bit to get used to. But you need to take a variable, so like percent security minimum. So this is the percentage of the prisoners in the unit that have minimum security classification, right? This color over here says whether it's high value or it's a low value. So, and down here we can see whether it's having a negative impact on the model or a positive impact on the model. So basically, if with percent minimum security, so if it's high, which these pink values are high values, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It's having a negative impact on violence. So when there's a high percentage of minimum security prisoners, then your violence is going to be lower, which makes sense, okay? If it's low, so that it's got blue values, then that positively contributes to violence. So that's how you interpret these shapely graphs, which I think is very useful. But it just takes a bit of time to learn how to use it. So if you look at gang affiliated, if you've got high levels of gang affiliation in your unit, so that's the pink values, then it positively impacts on prison violence, so contributes to prison violence. And so you can look at all the different types of variables. So the lead offence breaches are sort of people that aren't following the rules. When that's high, you can see that positively contributes to violence. But if you look at things like when your lead offence is drugs, then when that's high, that it negatively contributes to violence. So I guess people who are in prison for dealing with drugs maybe aren't so violent. Now I want to move into the sort of the mapping side, because I'm using maps to generate variables to try and understand violence. So just my background is in geography, as Abrielle said, and in particular it's Geographical Information Systems. So some of you might not be that familiar with what we call GIS in the industry, but actually you're all probably users of GIS. So an example of GIS is Google Maps. But that's just one small example of what we can do with Geographical Information Systems. But basically, with GIS, we represent the world as a series of layers, and this all consists of data, and this data all aligns because it's using a coordinate system. So we can align data by space using coordinates. So we have aerial images of prisons. Okay, so this is public information. These images that I can get hold of are geographically referenced, so they have coordinates with them, which means that they have scale. So I can measure distances and measure the areas of different spaces in prisons. So you can get a good feel for the layout of prisons. And I mean, you can be quite detailed as well. So we can sort of see the space that is inside and the space that is outside, and we can use the GIS to measure that. So take a prison like this, and I can digitize, and I did get the help of people in corrections to do this, to create polygons around the inside space and get polygons of the outside space, and then the GIS, because it's got scale, it can measure the size of these polygons. So then we can get information on the area of the inside space. So this is for high security. So you can see it's 660 meters squared. That's the inside space. The outside is 100 meters squared. So we can get the outside areas as a proportion of the total space. When you know the number of prisoners, you can then look at the density of the prisoners in relation to the outside space, and also density of the prisoner in relation to the total area. So we can generate all sorts of statistics when we have this spatial information or this area information. Again, you can see the difference between the prisons. So these are low security, and you can see that there's a lot more outside space. It's a higher proportion, so 56% as opposed to 14% in the high security of the total area is the outside space. You can get a count of the number of prisoners. So you can look at the density of the prisoners, in this case per 100 meters squared. So you can see the density is a lot lower than in low security compared to high security. Right, so I can graph this. So the number of prisoners, so we've got the prison density here, and we've got the violence. So all these points represents prison units. Okay, so this is, and there's also different years here. So there might be 10 years of data here. So each year was a separate data point, and each unit is a separate data point. That was looking at this one here, violence versus prisoner density, but we can look at violence versus prison unit that is inside. So look at the percent of unit that is inside space, and then compare that with prison violence. We can also look at serious violence, and then again look at this in terms of the prisoner density, and then also look at it in terms of the inside space. Again, when you look at these graphs, it doesn't seem to be any obvious trend. And because there's so much data there, there's over 2,000 data points, then even a slight trend can be statistically significant. So just looking at this, you do see some trends, but this is looking at both low security and high security combined, okay, which is problematic because we know that with high security, there's a higher rate of violence, and with higher security, there's a higher density. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit more about that. But we can see here that when we combine both the security levels, that there's a positive relationship when the prisoner density to inside space is high, then there's also higher levels of violence. Okay, so it's positive. Prisoner density for outside space is high, then it's high. It positively correlates with violence. And we get a negative one for outside space. Okay, so when the percent outside is high, then it negatively correlates with violence. Okay, but yeah, the problem with this is that we're combining high security and low security units here. When I do this correlation analysis, looking at low security and the high security separately, right, the relationships change. So with low security, we're getting a positive correlation. So prison density to inside space is really high, then there's more violence. If we look at it with high security, you get an opposite relationship, but these aren't significant, right? So the relationship's not that strong. But when prison density is high, then you get lower prison violence. Okay, so I think within the prison context, you've got high density of prisoners, then it's easier for the corrections officers to manage the prisoners. Okay, so they can actually reduce violence by having more control over the prisoners. So if you've got a larger prison unit, so the density of prisoners is lower, then it's harder to control. So we're seeing where we are seeing significant results is violence against staff, and we're seeing when prison density for the outside space is, say, high, you're getting lower levels of violence against staff. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I've got some new variables there from the GIS, and so I can put them into this machine learning and see how that changes the model. Well, I've got a slight improvement from putting them into the machine learning, it's just a small improvement in performance. And you can see some of these what I call spatial variables, so you have to look hard for them. But this one here, prisoners per inside area, right? When that's high, that reduces the violence. Okay, and it's the same with this other statistic that comes up here, prisoners per total area, so the prisoner density, basically. When that's high, you reduce your violence. Yeah, I mean, this may reduce violence in prisons by having high density, but it doesn't really take into account the welfare of prisoners, so that's a different issue. Okay, another application was mapping the actual location of violence within a prison unit. So the COBRA, like I say, it's a fantastic database, and it actually records the exact location of a particular incident, right down to the actual cell and the cell number. So we can produce a whole lot of prison counts of violence for each room in the prison unit. So what I can do with the GIS, again, we have these aerial images which have scale. I can get a hold of plans. Okay, so this is confidential, so I'm not going to specify what area it is. But we get a hold of the plans. That could be architectural plans, but often it's been the fire evacuation plan for a prison unit, and that the corrections has agreed to share with us. And then that has the layout of all the rooms, and we can find out the actual numbering of the prison cells as well. So we take this and we can align it. So that's sort of one of the functions of GIS is it's called georeferencing. We can align this data with our aerial photo, which has location and scale, and then we actually produce a GIS layer of the prison unit, and then we can populate that layer, which we call it attribute data, by the actual room number. So give it the name of the room. So it might be a kitchen. We also give it the name of the prison unit it's in as well. It's a little bit time consuming to generate this information, but then what we can do is we can take our GIS, what we call spatial data, and then take the COBRA data, which has it right down to the different cells, and we can combine it. And then once we have these polygons, will have this attribute information, so they have a count of the violence. We can then symbolize these polygons by giving them colors that represents the number of violent incidences. So we can then produce maps of each of the units, and so we can see where the violence has been occurring within the unit. This is taking the same prison and with 5 different units. And you can see there's a lot of variation in the violence between the units. So these will have different security classes, these units, which will explain a lot of the variation in the violence. But also we can see that there are changes from year to year. Okay, so these are all the same design. You can see that they all have a similar design, and yet the violence can vary quite a lot between these units. So obviously there are other factors besides design that affect the rates of violence, which I've been talking about, security level, gang membership, and so on. One of the, I'm a critical thinker, so I look at these and I think, well, are these very useful? And I mean, one of the things from a cartography perspective is that it's dominated by the large polygons. So there are a lot of small polygons here that you can hardly see, and there could be very high violence in there. So it could be bright red, dark red there, and because it's a small polygon, you're not seeing it. Your eyes is dominated by the large polygons. So from a cartography point of view, these maps can be quite misleading. But an unexpected result, and this is what you get with research, is that I'm working with Ara Poutama, and he's doing a separate piece of work where he's going in using a method called PRISM, which is called Promoting Risk Intervention by Situational Management. And basically, he's going into the units and having conversations with some of the prisoners and also the corrections staff and also some of the senior leaders. And what he's found is that these maps, he shows them these maps, and it initiates conversations. So, I mean, one of the first things is, if you've been working here, I mean, the first thing you probably do is try and interpret these maps, right? Go, oh, what's going on here? Why is this different to that? And so on. And then, you know, what's the variation in the years? And so they might go, oh, yes, right, we had so-and-so in that unit there, and he caused all sorts of trouble and stuff. And so Armin, he wants to have these conversations. So this was a great way of initiating conversations about what's been going on in these units over the time period. So was an unexpected result, and it's been quite useful for Armin's research. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about prison design. I'm not an expert on prison design. I mean, I've only really been researching prisons for about 5 or 6 years. I've really brought into the project for my quantitative skills and my GIS skills. But I mean, I have been talking sort of anecdotally with corrections officers and some prisoners. I mean, and it seems that a lot of them like this sort of camp design, right? That seems to be like the ideal sort of design from a prisoner's perspective and corrections perspectives. But that's just my anecdotal sort of viewpoint. I think we need to do a lot more research on prison design, and it needs to be more from a qualitative perspective as well. It's only a certain amount you can do with quantitative research. But you can see that there's a lot of variation in designs. So this is Spring Hill, this is the new Waikato prison. And there's also huge amounts of money being spent. So, I mean, the Spring Hill prison, I mean, this is a very expensive prison, and it's designed to be like a campus. So it's got a big prison wall around around all of the units. And I mean, the idea was that the prisoners could move around and go to different workshops and go to the gym or go work in a factory. But in the end, I mean, they're even supposed to play rugby here. But in the end, because of security problems, the prisoners have been pretty much kept into these units. And these units are quite small because they were designed so that the prisoners could go into the wider part of the prison. But in the end, they end up getting locked in their units. So they spend a lot of time in these units, and they're very small. And actually, it becomes less desirable prisons to spend your time in because of these. You end up being kept in these very small units, and so there's a lot going on in this space. This is the new Waikato. It's a similar sort of campus type design. They've got a rugby field. I mean, they've got a rugby field here, but no one ever plays rugby. It's just not used. And so, we're spending, this prison costs, around $1 billion. And my argument would be that we should spend a proportion of the cost of building a prison on research, so we fully understand what types of prisons work in the New Zealand context. I mean, I understand that some of these prison designs are coming from ideas from Australia, which is a different context. So, I mean, even if you spend 10% on research, and it could save you a lot of money, researchers could do a lot with $100 million and really work out what sort of prison designs are most effective and so on. So it's just for a plug that we should spend more on research and try and reduce our costs of building prisons. So that's it for me. I'd just like to acknowledge the Department of Corrections for providing the data for this research, and also MB and the Endeavour Fund for funding the research. So thank you.